I'm Danielle Metz.
I'm Robert Vaughn.
And this is the Danielle Metz Show, broadcasting on WBCQ. Quote, psychologists strive to blah blah blah, patriarchy, bad, blah blah blah, ableist, sexist, ageist, bad, blah blah blah, traditional masculinity, bad, blah blah blah, just everything normal is bad, blah blah blah, white, heterosexual men, so very bad. That pretty much sums up the American Psychological Association 2008 report titled Guidelines for Psychological Practice with Boys and Men. Sorry, Robert, the report broke my brain. Swimming through absolute unbelievably stupid statements such as, quote, adherence to rigid masculinity norms for aging gay, bisexual, transgender, and gender non-conforming persons has been correlated with higher incidence of self-destructive behaviors, physical and mental health problems, and fears of not being able to express their male identity due to dementia or being misgendered after death. I can't imagine that if I was suffering from dementia or on death's doorstep that I'd be worrying about my gender identity at that point in time. I am pretty sure I'd have more pressing concerns. This is identity politics at its extreme. I would say most extreme, but I'm sure they'll top even this at some point because progressives gotta progress. I started researching this paper with a highlighter in hand and make note of specific points which I wanted to refer. But even my highlighter rebelled, since every line of this document was so absurd as the one that followed, I would have had to have highlighted the whole document in its entirety. Quote, understanding the likely involvement of genetic factors in the development of gender identity has been especially effective in reducing transphobia in men. These biological factors may especially be helpful for individuals with religious affiliation and conservative social and political views, who may equate masculinity with heterosexuality. At first, I thought this may be another one of those grievance study hoax papers, given how many popular postmodern victimhood buzzword it employs. It comes across as a parody of itself, only slightly more sophisticated than Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's Green New Deal. And I'm a fast reader, but this document was so cumbersome and incoherent and so vile that I had to keep rereading entire paragraphs because my mind would not accept what I was reading. It was incomprehensible and meaningless. I'll admit that I only made it through about 3/4 of the way through the seemingly interminable 19 pages because it continuously repeated itself as if someone gave the authors a thesaurus and had them restate the same principle over and over again using different 100-point Scrabble words. What the thrust of this article boils down to is that white, heterosexual, young, and able-bodied man must realize is that he's no longer the norm in masculinity. What is the new norm? It's the non-white, the non-straight, non-binary, non-gender conforming, non-ableist, non-aged. The new masculinity is the negation of man, the non-man. And so, Robert, I believe you are, in fact, a white, heterosexual, able-bodied male. How do you feel about being emasculated?
Like anybody who feels that they're being emasculated, I guess. It's painful. It's painful. I read this thing through, and I've got a number of observations. I can go through them. Maybe we can just go back and forth, see what you think about. Okay. First one I thought of was that, of course, you've already mentioned it, this is a postmodernist document written by postmodernists. When you talk about, you mentioned the norm, right? They would try to reduce the norm. They would try to change it because it was the norm.
Yes.
There are abnormalities. On any bell curve, you'll find abnormalities. I mean, it stands to reason. As a matter of fact, it's part of the definition of a bell curve is that there are outliers from the norm. So what they were trying to do in almost all walks of life is take those outliers and make them more normal than they really were, and take the norm and flatten the bell curve, basically. Make us all the same. It fits right in with their moral relativism. But
yes, all cultures are equal. Everything is equal. There's
exactly.
No unless you're a straight white man, and then you're off the charts.
Well, they want to, like, again, if they think of something as good, like they call, for example, middle-class white males to be a dominant hierarchy, and that you can think of that in the terms of the bell curve as well, dominant being on top of the curve. They just want to cut that curve down and bring men down to match what's on the outliers, the abnormal. And
what purpose do you think they're trying to achieve this? Like, what do you think the end goal is?
Well, I always go back to what I continually say on most of our shows, is that it is the objective of the left. It is a death cult. Their objective is to destroy that which is good for being good, as Ayn Rand would say. That's their end goal. They cannot take the fact that there is an objective reality, that men are men, boys will be boys, if you wish, and they just don't like the fact that reality exists, with regardless of whether or not they like it or not. So you're talking about a whole class of people, unfortunately it's a very large segment of population, who are dissatisfied with reality, who try to manipulate it in such a way to conform to their ideas of what a utopia should be, and they don't care one way or the other who gets destroyed in the process. So that's your motivation right there.
So do you think it's an out and out power grab, and it's like they're willing to destroy the earth and rule over the ashes, or do you think that that's
sure.
pretty much what they're? Yeah, that's my take on it as well. And the way they do that is they destroy concepts. That's what this whole document is destroying a concept of masculinity.
It's an epistemological nightmare. It's very interesting. If you look at some of the wording that they use in it, for example, they start off by saying, where is it? Psychologists strive. Now, on the face of it, okay, that's one poor use of words where their psychologists strive, but they use it over 30 times in this 19-page document. They almost start every paragraph with it. Psychologists strive this way. That. And I was reminded when I'm reading it of that movie, Silence of the Lambs. It puts the lotion on its skin. It's not an observation, psychologists strive. It's a command. It's an order. It's a dehumanizing order to the plebes. There are tens of thousands of members in the Psychological Association. To do what we tell you. Psychologists strive to do this. If you do not do that, you're not a psychologist. So it's
and I noticed they made masculinity an ideology as opposed to just traits. They said
masculinities.
Masculinities and such traits as achievement, adventure, and risk. That's an ideology, not just what comes naturally to males. I just found it's very dehumanizing, the whole thing.
It is, and it's written by a committee, and it's certainly
surprisingly mostly men. I flipped to the end and I was like, I thought for sure this was written by feminists, women feminists, but this apparently was written by men, and I'm like, one woman name I believe is in the acknowledgement at the end of the article.
And if you look at all the citations in there, it's self-referential as well, which, by the way, is another characteristic. I think if you look up postmodernism, you'll find that it's all very self-referential. They're not referring to reality. They always refer to themselves.
Yeah, I was going to say they can't. We have to perpetuate the narratives. Therefore, the only thing we can refer to is ourselves.
It's true. And if I went through the document, and I noticed the authors, and I noticed the citations. And the authors are citing themselves tens of times, each one of them. Got at least a dozen referrals in the citation. So
they're giving themselves accolades by writing an article about themselves.
Now, mind you, in any endeavor, for example, in science, if you're writing a science paper, you usually do refer to your previous work to bring forth your new idea. But there's somewhat of a limit. And in the social sciences or in psychological studies, non-experimental ones like this, to refer to yourself continually and your books, not necessarily your studies, but your books, that becomes rather self-serving and definitely a characteristic of postmodernism.
And also not something, like if you're doing a scientific paper, scientific papers tend to be focused on things that are laboratory tests that are not replaceable, what's the word I'm looking for? Reproducible. Replicatable, that's the word, thank you. So
reproducible, yeah.
Yeah, reproducible, same thing. This is just their opinion. That's all this is.
It's philosophizing. It's armchair philosophers, yes.
Go ahead.
No, I was thinking, I just was going on to another observation I had in here, which also, again, it's postmodernism writ large. It's contradictory. For example, they say that sex is assigned at birth. Assigned.
Yes.
By whom? Not nature. It's assigned by society. Gender is a social construct. In other words, others decide your gender. Society decides your gender. If that's so, first of all, how can I, being a member of society, if I say that someone, a man pretending to be a woman, is a man, how can I be wrong? I'm part of society. I tell you what your gender is. Society tells you what your gender is. How dare you? How arrogant? How much hubris do you have to say that I as a man want to be a woman? You know, that's contradictory. To
the snake eating the tail.
to tell others what you think your gender is runs counter to the postmodernist collective idea. You cannot be an individual in postmodernist thought.
No,
or if you are
part of a group.
Yeah, you're part of the elite if you're an individual. So there's a contradiction to you. Sex is assigned by society, and yet they love the fact that an individual can say what sex they are or gender. Total contradiction. It's almost like it's your sex is assigned and your gender is assigned by democratic poll. Society has decided.
Which way is the wind blowing today? That's your gender for this evening.
Exactly.
I also noticed they one of my favorite comments, like you said, they're contradictory, is when they said the men perpetuate patriarchy, but they themselves are victims of the patriarchy because it doesn't allow them to become adaptive. And I'm like, what? So men perpetuate their own victim status? It's just absolute garbage. The whole thing is garbage.
There's another contradiction there as well. These are the people writing guidelines for the APA. So in other words, they are part of the patriarchy, if you will, or the archy, whether it's patriarchy or not. But they are at the pinnacle of power, even though the APA is not really a powerful organization. It is more or less a voluntary group. But
they do give accreditation to people.
If they, I don't know if they can accredit people. It's usually university boards, and your certification is given by boards in states and provinces. I think you just get a membership in this particular organization. The thing is, though, that here they are, part of the patriarchy, and saying that they can't adapt because of the patriarchy, and yet they've already obviously adapted. They're now in control. So, again, a contradiction.
It's hilarious. You just remind me of something else, and I've completely lost my train of thought.
But if you go through the document, you mentioning the epistemological and the changes that you're trying to make, saying sex is now gender is assigned. For example, masculinity means this, it didn't mean that. Bob and I continually go through this, your father and I on Just Right, talking. One of the best resources anybody can have when they're thinking is a dictionary. We're using words to communicate. So if I wanted to say to you masculinity, I better know what I'm talking about as far as that definition goes. Otherwise, I have to define my terms. As Rand says, in any discussion, define your terms, because your opponent may not use that same term as you would. And masculinity is from the Latin, and it means having to do with maleness. Okay, so there cannot be...
not femaleness. That is actually a very important distinction in the definition.
So you cannot pluralize it. There are no such things as masculinities.
It's an anti-concept.
It is an anti-concept. It's complete destruction of a concept, and they hope that it becomes male practice so that they can insidiously get in their postmodernist ideas.
The destruction of definitions and concepts is what they start out to do. And this is a guideline, apparently, for boys and men's. But what did you see any recommendations in there, or was it? To me, all I saw was just condemnation. I didn't see if so and so is striving or having problems with this, then maybe you may want to do this. It was all like they're going to feel this way and it's bad because of such and such. There's no guidelines. There's no behavioral recommendations.
Most of this document was geared not to as a guideline to practice with men and boys. It was strictly, I think, guidelines to facilitate practice with those outliers of the bell curve. Not men as such or boys as such, in other words, the norm, men who know that they are men and think that they are men and act in a male way, stereotypically or culturally, whatever. Not boys for the same reason, but the outliers, men who are gay, men who think that they are women, men who have problems with their sexuality or their role as a male in a family or whatever. It was an abnormal approach to men, not the normal approach. When they do talk about maleness, men and boys who are what we would call quote-unquote normal, they are suggesting in the guidelines that they be treated as being defective.
Yes.
They're saying that men who think that they are men can be re-educated. And they almost use that word. I'd have to find it here, but they do say through education, men can be instructed on how they are furthering the dominant patriarchy and their privilege. Total nonsense, but what they're trying to do is take normal society, make it abnormal, and abnormality, make it the norm. And again, whenever I use the word abnormal, by the way, or normal, and I have to qualify this all the time because people just don't understand, again, language and the terms, and get out a dictionary. The norm simply means it's not a value statement. It's not a judgmental word.
It's a statistical statement.
It's a statistical statement, exactly. That area under the curve that 90% of the population fall under. For example, I think that 1% of the population are lesbian, according to some studies. And anywhere up to 14% of the population could be homosexual men. So they are abnormal. But again, it's not a value judgment, and it's not a political statement. Kudos to them. I'm happy for them. But
We're fine with that.
Exactly. But it's an abnormality, only in a statistical sense. It's not a functional abnormality. It's not a mental dysfunction. It's not a healthy dysfunction. It is just the way it is. Now, when you get into transgenderism, you're crossing the line into a psychological dysfunction, I think. And it's not...
Well, that's also statistically played out by the suicide rates of people who suffer from that, and the depression rate. So there is an underlying problem behind that, where gays and lesbians, they're just like you and me. There's no underlying condition to that.
Right, and to the credit, of course, for any rational person out there, there is some value, I think, in letting people, psychologists, right, who are out counseling people, educating people. They're not clinicians, but they are professional people trying to help people. And I think it's important to perhaps talk about, at least, the fact that there are people out there, men or women, who think that they are the opposite gender or sex, and they are going through a hell of a time because of that dysphoria. And there should be guidelines, perhaps, maybe not guidelines, maybe not strict guidelines, in how to deal with them, how to approach them, to understand their concerns. No problem with that whatsoever. I do have a problem with this particular document because it's so blatantly wrong.
This is saying that the norm is abnormal, essentially. Like they say, where's the quote here? For instance, socialization for conforming to traditional masculine identities ideologically has been shown to limit male psychological development, constrain their behavior, and result in gender role strain and gender role conflict. So right there, they're saying traditional masculinity causes psychological problems. So they're saying traditional masculinity is a psychological issue and a disease.
Yeah, that's what I got out of it too. That's why I'm talking about why they think that the bell curve has to be flattened out.
And they say stuff like practices that teach boys at an early age to be self-reliant, strong, and to minimize and manage their problems on their own yield adult men who are less willing to seek mental health treatment. How much more blatant can you be? It's just
it is very blatant, as you say. They don't even try to conceal it anymore because they are now part of the dominant hierarchy. Postmodernism.
They're the elite.
They are the elite. Postmodernists are in charge. And so they can spout their nonsense with impunity because no one's going to challenge this except people like you and I.
Yep.
And but it brings up the question, and it went through my mind about what they mean by normal masculinity, because I can only go from personal experience of here what I think normal masculinity is. Being a man and knowing men, I know that there's a gamut of behavior and thoughts and ideas and expressions.
You mean we're all individuals?
We are all individuals.
Wow, who would have thought?
I'm not. But yes, we're all individuals. And for them to suggest then that there is a normal way to behave and it is the dominant way to behave and it is oppressive is of course nonsense. There's lots of men out there who have never heard a fly because the normal expectation of masculinity is violent. right? Or at least the potential to be violent. All men are rapists is the common third wave feminist refrain.
Yeah, God.
So, I mean, what is masculinity? And if you go by Hollywood, who's your masculine characters? Clint Eastwood, Charles Bronson, Chuck Norris, those kinds of people who can be violent, who can be...
Liam Neeson.
Well, maybe that's not maybe a good choice. Keanu Reeves, John Wick. Yeah, there's your masculine idea. And unfortunately, a lot of people take their psychology, take their philosophy from Hollywood. And what's Hollywood except just a collective of postmodernists? So I don't know that it serves us well to be defining masculinity as necessarily in the terms that they think that it is, a dominant gender over women. If you go into a lot of households, that's absolutely wrong.
Yeah, no kidding. And it's interesting because my eldest son, he's going into college next year, and he had 2 college course selections, and one of them was police studies, the beginning course of that, and his other one was early childhood education. Why? Because he loves being around kids. That is a traditional male role now. That's not abnormal. That is considered. My husband, when I worked full time, he stayed home with the kids. And I have twins, a boy and a girl, and I can tell you there are distinct differences between the two, but they both have their strengths and they're individuals. Collectively grouping people together just drives me nuts because there's such a wide like you said, there's the curve. There's such a wide variation. You can't nail everybody down to specifics. Most men aren't violent. Most men are loving. Most men love their kids. They love their wives or girlfriends or their boyfriends or whatever. And most people are just good people.
True.
I wish people would stop villainizing everybody.
And if you think about in Hollywood, at least, where you have your Clint Eastwoods and those male figures, stereotypically male figures, you also have people, men who are not your stereotypical male, like a Charlie Chaplin, or a Stan Laurel. Those kinds of Hollywood characters who were shy, timid, effete, feminine, not aggressive at all, more likely to run away from a fight than to engage in a fight.
Well, and also what they did was they engaged in humor. That was their strategy. That's why you get a lot of male comedians, because there's either you're the strong man or the comedian is a stereotype. To be stereotypical.
Yes, we want to be careful about being stereotypical. But I think there's nothing wrong with generalizing. There's nothing wrong with being stereotypical.
You have to, otherwise you can't define anything.
Well, exactly. That's what a concept is. It's a concept is trying to take something and remove those aspects of it that don't apply. For example, a concept of a table. Well, you can have 1,000 different kinds of tables or more, but they have a particular function and a particular form. So in other words, you can have a table that, you can't have a table with 2 legs, but you can have a table with 3.
3, yes.
Or 10, right? But so there is a way of generalizing concepts, and you can certainly generalize masculinity or femininity, but there comes a point when the outliers, those 2-legged tables, trying to be tables, are not tables. Sorry, fella, that you're not a table. It all comes down to epistemology. Bob has identified this on Just Right all the time. It all comes down to ideas, concepts, and epistemology. Definitions.
It's that is the most important thing. That's the only way you can think.
And it's the goal, I think, of postmodernism, to take those concrete terms. In other words, terms that have been concretized. I'm not talking about concrete in the sense that they're immutable totally, but or that you can have abstract concepts, but take these things which mean something and have meant something for hundreds of years and have an etymology that you can follow and understand, and then just destroy them completely and try to make them mean something else. Black is now white, up is now down, blue is now red, male is now female.
And it lends itself to less subjective thinking and more just generalized feeling, because you can't trust the concepts. All you can go on is what you feel about them, because you can't define them. And that's what they're doing. And then that gets us into the manipulation aspect of it, because then all they have to do, if they've destroyed the mind, then all they have to do is manipulate your emotions. And that's how they get you to act the way they want you to act. And that's how they get power.
Exactly. It used to be said that if you want power, you just have to control the currency. But what's the currency of ideas? It's words. It's language. It's how we communicate, and they're trying to, through this document and postmodernists or any other document, are trying to control the currency of the mind. And that's how they're controlling people. They're putting themselves as the dominant hierarchy. They're becoming that which they hate.
Yes, they are the new patriarchy. And since most of the authors were men, that's not unsubstantiated. Well, I don't know, Robert, but this just destroyed my mind. I swear, I've been reading this document for the last 3 or 4 days, and I couldn't. My brain rebelled. I mean that absolutely. I'm not exaggerating. My brain just kept going, that doesn't make any sense. That's ridiculous. How could they say that? And it's just beyond the pale.
It was hard to get through, and I have a degree in psychology, and I found it very difficult. I don't think I could go to university today and continue my studies.
No. Oh, God. Well, actually, you could do it and have fun and just keep poking the professors. Because you've already got your degree. Just go for, a lark.
Yeah, there's better ways to have fun, I think, than to be self-torturing myself by going back to school to learn more about what this nonsense is. But I think people out there have to understand that this is not a one-off case. This was made last year, I think, or was it 2017?
Yeah, 2018. And apparently it's in force until 2028.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's another postmodernist thing. And they haven't come up with something that's absolute, and that they identify, to use that word, that they may be wrong. Who's to tell? There is no objective reality. What we say today may expire.
Or there may be some more rules that they haven't thought up yet about who's bad and who's worse and where the victim hierarchy comes into play. That's constantly shifting. That intersectionality is constantly shifting. So they have to be willing to be able to rewrite the rules again to fit that in there.
Can you imagine a physicist or a chemist or a chemist or a physicist writing a textbook and prefacing it by saying, this book expires in 2020? Because
gravity may not work in 2 years. You never know. Because
yeah, that's what I always disliked about a lot of what I read in psychology and the social sciences, is that it is a very infantile field, and in that I mean that it's very young. It has a long way to go. And unfortunately, documents like this are not adding to the robustness of this fledgling field of study. But this is not a one-off, though. I think if you go to any other field of study, and I understand now it is infiltrating some of the harder sciences like math and physics and that.
It is.
If you go to their groups and look at their guidelines, I think you'll see that this postmodernist language and postmodernist concepts are infiltrating them as well, so that they don't offend. They have to basically adapt to the modern or postmodern language that people are using, so that they don't to get fired.
Yeah,
quite literally lose their jobs, if not get put in jail these days for saying something that goes against the postmodernist narrative.
Yep, especially if you're in the UK. That one woman who said something against she dead named apparently a transgender woman, and the cops threw her in jail for 7 hours.
Yes, and questioned her as to her motivations.
Yeah, and the guy, the ex-policeman who liked the limerick, and he got a call from the cops asking what his mindset was. It was a
half-hour interrogation over the phone.
Yeah. Because he liked and shared a limerick. Okay. This is where we're headed. This is the scary part. And it's like death by 1,000 cuts, because people don't see it. They see little examples here, little example there, and they just brush it off. It's like, oh, don't worry about that. That's just psychology. They're all nuts over there anyway. But no, it's creeping until suddenly you turn around and you're in jail because you liked a limerick.
What was it in a recent Mark Steyn show that you sent me the link to?
Yeah, the noticing, not noticing.
Yeah, what is noticed and what is not noticed. And I think he was reading from a member of his club or whatever, one of his fans, saying that they recently watched the trials of Nuremberg and judgment at Nuremberg. And the judge, Spencer Tracy, I think he was asking, if I remember the movie correctly, his servants in the mansion, what did you do under Hitler? How was it? And did you know about what was going on? And they go, no, we know nothing. We saw nothing. They didn't notice. How could they notice? And Mark Steyn went through how how easily people are deceived when things happen incrementally and
Yep.
through nuance. And until we get to the point when we have this trash coming out from what once was a respected 120-odd-year-old institution of what used to be a reputable science.
Yep.
So notice, people, take notice of what's going on around you and don't dismiss it. Like he said,
the little
Mark Stein
things,
said,
the little
you
things
see,
make
but
the
you
big
don't
things.
notice.
Yeah, they said the little things are what make up the big thing. It's like you notice the little thing, and then there's a lot of little things that make up the big things, and you got to notice both of them. And he also Go on.
Yeah, what did Spencer Tracy say at the end of that movie? I think he went into the prison cell of one of the men he convicted, and one of the men said, "I didn't know what was going on. Like, how could it have gotten this bad? That millions of people died." And he said, "You were at fault, and you knew the minute that you sentenced to death an innocent man, one innocent man."
Yep.
And so with every single psychologist strive to, or masculinities, or every change of the word, every subtle difference that we're letting it creep into our language, a tragedy will finally result. And it's just up like you and me, you and I notice.
We notice. I spend my day noticing.
There was a phrase in one of the Sherlock Holmes, starring Jeremy Brett.
Ah, those are good ones.
Where I think he asked Watson, of course he had a flat that was on the second floor, and he asked Watson, "How many stairs coming up to my flat?" And Watson says, "I don't know." And of course Sherlock Holmes could tell him, and he says, "How do you know all these things?" He says, "You observed, but you didn't notice." Right? In other words, it's all there in front of everybody to see. You just have to notice it.
Yep. Very good. And on that note, take care, notice things, and we'll talk to you next week.